I'm Kaylee and I'm here today with Sienna. So, first we'll introduce ourselves. So, my name, as I said, is Kaylee. I'm a biology tutor with GradReady and I am a final year med student at UWA. And I have received an offer to do internship at Sir Charles Gardner Hospital next year, which is very exciting. So, I'll hand over to Sienna.
Congrats, Kaylee. Congrats on that offer, Kaylee. That's really exciting. Um, my name is Sienna. I'm a third year medical student at Sydney University, and I have a med sci degree from Sydney University as well. And I'm currently a humanities tutor for GradReady.
So, our first topic for this is about how the GAMSAT results are presented. So when you're given your GAMSAT score, you don't just get your total score, you get your scaled score for each of the three sections, so your section 1, section 2 and section 3 score, and then you also get your overall score first. And then we're going to explain a little bit about each of these scores and how they're calculated, but we'll just start with the overall score. So the way that GEMSAS calculates it and the way that some of the universities calculate it is they get your section 1 score, your section 2 score, and then 2 times your section 3 score, add that all together, and then divide by 4, and that gives your overall score. So you notice that there's 2 times section 3 score. That means that the sciences section is essentially double weighted compared to the other sections. So if you are strong at science, you might have a better shot, I guess, at applying for the universities that weight this way. But there's also other universities that just do a straight average of the 3 sections with all sections equally weighted. So depending on what you like with science versus humanities, this could work in your favour or not.
Yeah, this has been a recent development. I know at Sydney University when I was applying, that was a relatively new approach for them to weight each of the sections evenly, but it ended up working in my favour, and it definitely can work in some students' favours as well.
Yeah, whereas for me, I was more of a strong science student, so um, the original weighting where the science is weighted more, that was better for me.
Mm.
So it changes from person to person. So theoretically, the maximum score is 100, but this is unheard of. The highest score I've ever heard of was 88, but the highest score I know from someone I personally know is 84. To get a maximum score of 100, you basically need to be the top student or among the top students for every single section. So you can appreciate that. That's pretty uncommon. Your overall score is presented as a number, and you're also given a little percentile curve that shows you how your score compares to everyone else who sat the same exam as you. So you can basically see from the graph, say you got a score of 68, for instance, you can look at the graph and look at where 68 sits on that graph, and you can see what percentile you are based on that. So essentially what percentage of other candidates did you beat? And the curve can change a little bit for every sitting, so what's a good score one year might be slightly different to the score the next year. So while we talk a lot about the scores, it's also important to think about the percentile for your particular sitting as well. Anything else you wanted to add to that, Sienna?
Yeah, I think it's really important for students to know that just even a very small increase in the actual overall all score can really make a big difference in terms of moving people up or down that curve. So I would recommend people familiarize themselves with that curve because, as you said, even though it does change a little bit exam to exam, it is relatively consistent between exams. So you can kind of predict based on your raw score what percentile you're going to be sitting at. And it can really help to motivate you if you can see that, okay, maybe I'm only increasing my overall score by, say, 2 or 3 points, but when that correlates to, for example, I'm just pulling this off the top of my head, but say a 5 or 10 percentile increase, then that can be the difference between you getting an interview offer or an admission and not. So it's really important to have a good understanding of that. So obviously the aim is to be at the highest percentile possible. Unis do have a limited number of spots. So essentially they aim to take the top portion of the group in any given year. And over time, there's definitely been a shift of the curve to the right. So you do need a higher overall score to be in the top 20th percentile, for example, than you would have. Sorry, you need that now than you would have, say, a few years ago. So do be careful when you're trying to compare your raw scores over the years or between sittings if you do sit GAMSAT more than the once, because the changes in that curve can make it a bit misleading. So they also give scaled scores for each section, and those can be a bit harder to understand, and especially given ACER aren't completely transparent in how they do calculate these scores. But the general understanding of how it's likely to work is that you get scored separately for each section. So section 1 and section 2 being your humanities focuses, and then section 3 being the science focused section. So your exams are marked. I did probably 1 mark per correct response, and we're pretty sure that there's no half marks given. And then you do get a raw sum of the correct responses, but this doesn't necessarily constitute your score. So a section, say you get a score of 60 in the sciences section, that doesn't mean you got 60 out of 100 questions correct, for example. They do, we think, similar to how a lot of high school final exams are marked, they do likely sort of fiddle around with this scoring a little bit. So don't take the score too literally. But from there, the scores are generally standardized and then placed on a distribution, with the highest score being given sort of a mark of a scaled score of 100, and then everyone else's scores being distributed according to that. So the average score scaled is, the average score is generally scaled to whatever GEMSAS have decided to set as the average score for the standardization purposes. So this is really similar to how ATARs are calculated and other scores like that. I think that really sums up as much as we know about GAMSAT scoring. But as we said, it is hard to know exactly how these things happen, and ultimately, while it can help you inform your studying a little bit, it shouldn't be the pure focus of everything you're doing. Did you have anything else to sum up there, Kaylee?
Yeah, I think just in summary, like the simple explanation would just be it's a competition essentially, so you're trying to get more points than your competition, and the scores is just a sort of a little bit of a fancy way of ranking people, I guess.
And a lot of the time, individual section scores don't actually end up mattering. You just need to make sure you're scoring over the university cutoffs. So most universities have a minimum score that they'll consider that you need to achieve in each of the sections. But I think we're going to talk about this a little later on as well.
Yeah. So the most important score is your overall score. And as Sienna said, most of the time, as long as you score over the cutoff for the individual sections, normally around 50 to 55, then it doesn't really matter what you get in individual sections, as long as your overall score is good. We're going to move on now to talking about how your GAMSAT results are used. So hopefully you should know by now that the GAMSAT is used for postgraduate entry medical programs, but there's also a few other programs that use GAMSAT as well. So for example, dentistry at UWA uses GAMSAT, so does optometry at UMelb. And there's some overseas universities that use GAMSAT as well, particularly in Ireland and the UK. Thankfully, you get to choose which score you want to send. So if you sat GAMSAT 4 times in the last 2 years, you can choose which one of those 4 scores you want to send. So if you did badly one time and well the next time, then you can just send that one score that you did well, and the university won't know about your low score. So when the universities get your GAMSAT score, they will use your GAMSAT and generally your GPA as well and other factors to rank you for an interview. The actual criteria that they use varies from university to university. Usually it's GAMSAT and GPA, plus minus a portfolio if you're applying for Wollongong or Notre Dame. And the importance that the GAMSAT has in that, the weighting placed in the GAMSAT is also a little bit different as well. So in the past, a lot of universities, it was 50% GAMSAT, 50% GPA, and the portfolio universities were like a third GAMSAT, third GPA, third portfolio. But there have been some changes to the different universities, so just read their pages and make sure you stay abreast of how much each component's weighted. And then after the interview, the GAMSAT score is also used to rank you for admission. And again, the weighting of the GAMSAT in that varies depending on which university you're applying for. So I think that's sort of like in a nutshell. Sienna, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just think what you said about making sure you're on top of what universities that you're applying to, what they want and how they weight things, that's so important. So especially with all the changes that have happened in the past few years. For example, when you said have not had any interviews, GAMSAT has been the sole criterion that they've been using for admissions, and then only resorting to using your GPA when they do need sort of a tiebreaker between students. So it is really important. These things are changing constantly, so you do need to stay up to date on them. Another example is that University of Western Australia, I think they don't. Oh no, actually, is it University of Western Australia or Wollongong, Kaylee? Do you remember?
Sorry, what was the rest of the question?
That's all right. I know that some unis don't use GAMSAT to rank students post-interview. However...
UWA does.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say about UWA is that they've changed their weightings post-interview. I can't remember what they are now, but previously, after post-interview, it was like a third GAMSAT, a third GPA, a third interview. But I think they're now emphasising the interview more, so I think the interview's now 50%. And then GAMSAT and GPA, one of them's 30%, one of them's 20%. I can't remember which one is which. I just know that it probably would not have worked in my favour if I was applying today.
I feel like with all the changes that are constantly happening, it's always a bit of a luck of the draw what year you get admitted in, and you always sort of think, oh, I don't know if now I would actually get in, maybe. Who knows? But It's definitely just goes to show that your GAMSAT, while it's important, obviously your GAMSAT score isn't the be-all and end-all. You do need to make sure you're focusing on other aspects used for admission, like your undergrad GPA and your interview skills. But it is important to have an understanding of, when you're studying, you need to understand what constitutes a good, in inverted commas, GAMSAT score, because as we've said before, most universities do have an official minimum score that they're willing to take. So often that'll be they need a score of 50 overall, and that's a score, mind you, not a percentile. You also need section scores of 50 in each of the 3 sections individually. So if any one of your sections falls below that, even if your overall score is still over 50, you won't be considered for an interview or admission. So you usually do need scores, though, that are quite a lot higher than this. As we said, these are just absolute minimum cutoffs. You do generally need scores higher than this to be lucky enough to get an interview offer and be considered for admission. So as we said, with the curve changing year to year, so do cutoffs. And, these cutoffs are kind of determined in part based off that curve and the changes that they see in that. So a lot of the time, I believe that most universities don't publish their cutoffs before the GAMSAT sitting, and many universities don't publish them after the fact either. It is sort of a bit of a guess, and you do just need to base it on what you can find on the internet about previous scores that have been used to offer people interviews. And keep in mind that the scores can differ by what program you're trying to enter. So, as we said before, if you're trying to get into, say, dentistry versus medicine, it might be different. Or if you are potentially considered maybe, I think in some universities, if you're rural, they might use slightly different cutoff scores as well. So, as we've said a few times, it really does pay to just do your reading on what is required at the universities that you're hoping to apply for. This is really why ultimately your percentile is actually much more important than your raw score, because you want to be aimed to be performing in the top portion of the group that you sit GAMSAT with, because ultimately these are the people that are going to end up getting offers, and really the actual score is sort of a bit irrelevant in some senses. So I think Kaylee's going to give us a few good other rules of thumb to think about when we're sort of trying to figure out where your score sits amongst your peers, and in the context of previous years as well.
Yeah. So the average GAMSAT score most years is somewhere around 57, 58-ish. So if you get that, you're sort of bang in the middle. 50 probably did better than about 50% of people, but 50% of people also did better than you. So if you get a score a little bit higher than that, that already sort of increases your percentile ranking quite a bit. So a score in the low 60s, you get a slim chance of admission. You might be more lucky at universities that give the GAMSAT a lower weighting. So usually these are the portfolio schools like Notre Dame and Wollongong that tend to have less of a weighting on the GAMSAT because they also have portfolio. So if you've got lots of great volunteer experiences and things, then you might be able to get through with a low score in the low 60s, but it's pretty slim chances. If you get your score a little bit higher still, to the mid 60s, you've got a decent chance of getting an interview, and if you're lucky, even admission. But you need to make sure the other areas of your application are pretty strong as well. If your score is in the high 60s or low 70s, you've got a pretty good chance of getting in somewhere, though not necessarily your first preference. And just for reference, the 75th percentile was a score of 65, so if you've got a score in the high 60s, you're already sort of in the top 25% of students. If you've got a score in the high 70s, then the world is your oyster, and you should be able to get in pretty much anywhere that you want to go, as long as you don't have any glaring red flags in your GPA, plus minus portfolio if you're applying for Notre Dame or Wollongong. The 98th percentile normally sits somewhere around 75. So if you've got a score in the 80s, we always used to say, like, are you even real? But, I mean, as I said, I know people who've gotten scores that are that high. Not very common to see, though.
No, they're definitely very rare, but it does happen. Some people surprise themselves, I think.
Yes. And also important to note that these are general rules of thumb only. So as Sienna said, cutoffs tend to be lower for rural students, and that's because most universities, if not all of them, reserve a certain number of seats for rural students. So you'll only be competing with rural students for those spots, which means you're competing with a smaller pool, which means that it's not as competitive and you can generally get in with a lower score. The other important consideration is that GAMSAT's only part of your application, so if your GPA is really poor or your portfolio is really poor, then you're going to need a higher GPA to compensate. And then conversely, if you've got a really good GPA, you might be able to get by with a slightly lower GAMSAT. So it depends what university you're applying to and how much things are weighted. And another area that might be, another tip that might or might not be useful is There are a few universities that do publish their cutoffs. Most don't, but there are a couple that do. So it's worth having a look at the website of the university you're applying for to see if they have published cutoffs from previous years, just so you can get a general idea of what kind of scores that you're looking at. And then for other universities, our GradReady website has a list of unofficial cutoffs that sort of combine the GAMSAT and GPA scores, but I have to emphasise that these are very unofficial. They come entirely from self-reported scores, so they're not the most accurate because we're relying on people to report their scores, and the number of people actually report their scores on websites such as Paging Doctor and so forth is only a very small proportion of the total number of people who get accepted to a medical school. So try not to put too much emphasis on them. It's just to give you a general idea of what to aim for.
Yeah, and I think focusing a lot on those sort of self-reported scores that you can find out there. This is not talking about people that you know in person, maybe friends or colleagues, but sort of those just anonymous reportings of scores. Focusing too much on those can cause a lot of confusion and anxiety for some students. I know I've definitely heard that in the past. So I think know yourself and know whether that is something that's likely to cause a bit of anxiety for you. And if so, just, maybe try and avoid that and instead focus on yourself and your own score and just doing the absolute best that you possibly can. Really it is ultimately about bringing this back to what does all this information about scores and percentiles, what does that really mean for you? So if you don't get a good score the first or second time or any time you take the GAMSAT, that definitely doesn't mean you won't ever get a good score. As we've said, the scores that you can get GAMSAT to GAMSAT, they can change quite a lot sometimes. And even if your actual score doesn't change, like me, I sat the GAMSAT twice and my score was exactly the same both times. But the percentile ranking might change. What unis are looking to accept might change. In fact, both of those things are very likely to change year to year. So you can definitely need to realize that a lot of other factors than just the exam itself and the score go into it, but also like things like your performance on the day or the performance of other people on the day, things like stress and sleep, how many uni spots there are to fill around the country, and what other choices the universities make surrounding criteria and how they weight portfolios or interviews. All of these things ultimately play into whether or not you end up getting an offer. So while understanding your GAMSAT score and how universities choose these, while that's important, it's also important to look at the bigger picture sometimes. And another thing as well is that your scores definitely can improve, especially with added study. I think that was definitely one of my mistakes, is that I thought I didn't really need to study any more than I did the first time I sat the GAMSAT. But I have heard from so many students, I've seen it firsthand, those students that do study really hard between their, say, first and second GAMSAT sitting or any other GAMSAT sitting. A lot of them do see an increase, if not in their raw score, though often in their raw score. They'll see an increase in their percentile curve, which ultimately means they're performing higher in that group of students that are sitting the GAMSAT. So it's all about knowing what factors come under your control and doing your best to maximize all of those to really increase your chances of getting in.
Yeah, of course. And as you were saying, Sienna, like a lot of people, even if they don't get a good score the first or whatever time around, it's possible to get a good score another time around. Like I know people, and I'm sure you know people as well, who sat the GAMSAT multiple times and applied multiple times and eventually got in. It's not uncommon. I think one of the lecturers at my uni said that they generally get 9 applicants for each spot, so it's that means that, those other 8 applicants, assuming they didn't get in anywhere else, would be applying, well, either deciding not to reapply or sitting the GAMSAT again. So,
And I think it's also a really important point to raise that it is really important that if you're not happy with any of your section scores or your overall score after one sitting of the GAMSAT, do make sure that you're looking critically at your scores and really trying to use that information that you're being given to figure out where you can improve and where you should focus your study, highlighting what are your weakest sections, but also looking at where your strengths are and then trying to take learnings from how you approach questions. Say if you're really strong in the humanities, thinking about how you approach those questions and what strategies you use for those questions, that maybe you can transfer some of those skills over to your sciences section where maybe you're not doing as well. But really knowing that it also is important to prioritize studying for those sections where you are falling below the minimum cutoff score, because ultimately, as long as you have even just one section falling below the minimum cutoffs for universities, then you won't be considered for application to that university at all. So it's important to, as much as increasing your scores is really important, at least making sure you're over those cutoffs is the sort of bare minimum that you need to be doing. And realistically, looking at what you think you can improve between the next time you sit it. But unless you have anything else to add, Kaylee, I think that about wraps up everything we have to say about your GAMSAT results.
Yeah, I think that's about it. And yes, you probably will get the most bang for your buck by focusing on those weaker sections, because if you're already getting scores of 80 or so for a section, it's probably going to be pretty, the amount of effort to bump that up higher is going to be substantially more than bumping up another score from a 50 to a 55, for instance.
Yeah, very true. It's all about maximizing your returns for the effort that you put in.
Mm-hmm. We hope that you do well with your application. Best of luck. If you are a little bit stuck or you want some extra help with your application, GradReady has got plenty of other resources about improving your GAMSAT scores, also improving your interview skills as well, and also just looking at how to improve your chances of getting into med school in general. Thank you for listening.